This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The badge clipped to Elena Rossi's white coat read Dr. Elena Moretti, attending resident, and every letter of it was a lie. She stood in the marble-floored lobby of Grazioso Private Medical Centre, watching her own reflection ripple across the polished floor like something drowning, and reminded herself to breathe the way a doctor breathes, measured, unbothered, a woman who had spent a decade memorizing anatomy instead of learning how to disappear inside another person's name. She had learned the second skill instead. She was better at it than she wanted to admit. Grazioso didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a hotel that had swallowed a surgical wing. Chandeliers dripping crystal over the reception desk, orchids flown in from Ecuador twice a week, an elevator bank guarded by men in $5,000 suits who called themselves patient liaisons and carried Berettas under their jackets. Officially, it served New York's wealthiest, most private patients. Unofficially, everyone from the Bronx to Bay Ridge knew what Grazioso really was, the hospital where the Falcone family bled, healed, and buried their secrets under anesthesia. Elena's late sister Sophia had worked here for 3 years. Sophia had died here too. 8 months ago, in a locked office on the 4th floor, with a bottle of pills at her elbow and a note in handwriting the police said was hers, though Elena had read her sister's handwriting for 26 years and knew a forgery when she held one in her hands, shaking at 2A, in a precinct that had already closed the file. Suicide, they'd written, no signs of foul play. Elena had believed in a lot of things once: justice, due process, the idea that the truth eventually surfaced if you were patient enough. She had stopped believing in patience the day she buried her sister in a black dress that had once been Sophia's favourite colour, watching their mother collapse against a headstone while men in dark suits stood at a respectful distance, watching not out of grief, but out of something colder: ownership. As if they were making sure the bodies stayed buried along with whatever Sophia had known. That was the day Elena Rossi, 5 years into a promising career with a federal task force investigating organized crime infiltration of private healthcare, decided she would become someone else for as long as it took. 6 months of forged credentials. A medical license built from a real doctor's identity, a woman named Elena Moretti, who had, conveniently and tragically, drowned in a boating accident off Positano the year before. Her records scrubbed and rebuilt by people who owed Elena's handler favours too large to refuse. 6 months of cramming pharmacology and internal medicine like her life depended on it. Because it did. 6 months of learning to hold a scalpel like she'd been born holding one, to recite drug interactions in her sleep, to walk into a room full of real doctors and never once let her hands shake. She was good. She had always been good at becoming what a room needed her to be. "Dr. Moretti?" The voice belonged to a nurse, young, harried, clutching a tablet like a shield. "Chief of Staff wants to see you. Now, not later." Elena's pulse ticked up exactly once before she smoothed it flat. "Lead the way." The Chief of Staff's office sat on the 3rd floor, behind a door with no nameplate, which told Elena everything about how the hospital actually operated. Reputation mattered less here than discretion. Dr. Antonio Greco was 60, silver-haired, with the soft hands of a man who hadn't touched a patient in a decade, and the eyes of a man who had signed off on things he never wanted written down. He didn't stand when she entered. "Dr. Moretti, Your credentials are impressive. He said it the way a man says, I haven't verified any of this and I don't intend to, which was, Elena had learned quickly, precisely how Grazioso operated. Money changed hands so that questions never needed to be asked twice. You come to us from Chicago Memorial. Internal medicine, cardiology rotation. Excellent recommendations. Thank you. All fabricated, all airtight, all designed by people far more paranoid than Antonio Greco would ever be. We don't get many residents who transfer mid-career. He steepled his fingers. Most people who work here, Dr. Moretti, they come from families who already understand. Discretion is the entire practice of medicine at Grazioso. You understand discretion? I understand that some patients require it more than others. Something in his face eased, like she'd passed a test she hadn't known was being administered. Good. Because you've been assigned to a patient who requires it more than anyone in this hospital. He slid a folder across the desk, and Elena made herself take it slowly, casually, though every nerve in her body had gone taut as wire the instant she saw the name typed at the top. Patient, Falcone Domenico A. She had spent 6 months preparing to infiltrate this hospital. She had not, in her most careful planning, expected to be handed the crime boss himself on her first day. Mr. Falcone requires ongoing management for a chronic cardiac condition, Greco continued, oblivious to the way Elena's fingers had gone cold around the folder's edge. Our previous physician for his case retired unexpectedly. He is particular about who treats him. You'll report directly to his private residence for checkups, in addition to hospital visits when required. His security team will brief you on protocol. And if he doesn't approve of me? Greco's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Dr. Moretti, no one has ever not approved of Domenico Falcone's decisions. I'd suggest you simply be excellent. He notices excellence. A pause waited with something Elena couldn't yet read. He also notices everything else. She left the office with the folder pressed to her chest like armor, and it wasn't until she was alone in the stairwell, 3 flights down, that she let herself close her eyes and remember the name that had haunted every file Sophia had left behind, half erased, coded in a private shorthand Elena had spent months decrypting. D.F. Sophia had written it in the margins of her patient logs a dozen times, in a hand that grew increasingly urgent, increasingly frightened in the final weeks before she died. Elena had assumed it stood for a diagnosis, a drug, a department. Now she knew better. Her sister hadn't been documenting a patient. She had been documenting a man she loved. And Elena, imposter, liar, sister, agent, was about to walk into his house and become the second woman in his life to carry a secret large enough to get her killed. She adjusted the collar of her coat, straightened her spine, and told herself the same thing she'd told herself every day for 6 months. You are Dr. Elena Moretti. You do not flinch. You do not fall. You find out what happened to your sister, and you finish what she started. She did not yet know how badly that promise would cost her. The Falcone estate sat behind iron gates in Westchester, a limestone mansion that looked less like a home than a fortress built by someone who had once believed, correctly, that the world wanted him dead. Elena's car was stopped twice before she reached the front doors. First at the gate, where a man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow ran a wand over her medical bag with the thoroughness of an airport security line, and again at the entrance, where a second man in a black suit informed her, without apology, that she would be searched before she was permitted upstairs. "I'm his physician," she said, keeping her voice even. "Not an assassin. With respect, doctor, we don't take chances with either." She let them search her. She had learned in 6 months of training that the fastest way to earn a dangerous man's trust was to never fight the small indignities, only the ones that mattered. The house itself was a study in contradictions. Original Caravaggio school paintings hung above furniture no one seemed permitted to sit on. A music room with a Steinway that looked untouched in years. Hallways so silent her footsteps sounded like accusations. Everything beautiful, everything cold. Sophia had walked these same halls, Elena thought, feeling the ghost of her sister's presence settle over her shoulders like a second coat. Sophia had loved a man who lived like this, and it had killed her. She was led to a set of double doors on the second floor by a woman introduced only as Carmela, the housekeeper, whose eyes swept over Elena with an assessment so thorough it bordered on hostile. "He doesn't like new doctors," Carmela said, not unkindly, more like a warning offered out of habit. He liked the last one even less, at the end. Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. The last one? But Carmela had already opened the doors and stepped back, leaving Eleanor no room to ask further, because the man standing at the far end of the room had turned to face her, and every question in Eleanor's mind evaporated beneath the weight of his stare. Domenico Falcone was not what she had expected. She had built a picture of him from files and rumours, a man in his 50s, thick-necked, cruel in the obvious ways men in his profession tended toward cruelty. Instead, the man across the room was perhaps 38, tall enough that he filled the doorway of the study behind him, dressed in a black shirt open at the collar, despite the January cold outside the windows. His dark hair was cut close, his jaw carved sharp enough to draw blood, and his eyes, pale grey, almost silver, entirely wrong for a face that otherwise belonged to something ancient and Mediterranean, fixed on her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. He did not look sick. He looked like a man who had never once, in his entire life, been made to wait for anything. "You're not Dr. Reyes," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, accented faintly with something that lived between New York and Palermo. "Dr. Reyes retired. I'm Dr. Moretti." She set her bag down on the side table with hands that betrayed nothing. "I'll be managing your care going forward." "Will you?" It wasn't a question. He crossed the room slowly, and Elena made herself hold still, made herself remember that flinching in front of a predator was the fastest way to become prey. He stopped close enough that she could smell cedar and something darker beneath it, gunmetal or leather, and studied her face like he was reading a document written in a language he almost, but not quite, understood. "You're young for a doctor they'd trust with me." "I'm 31. That's not young in medicine, Mr. Falcone. That's simply young to you." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "You're not afraid of me." "I'm cautious of you. There's a difference." She reached for her stethoscope, needing the prop, needing something to do with her hands that wasn't gripping the edge of the table to stop them from shaking. "Your file says you're due for a cardiac panel. Shall we begin, or would you prefer to intimidate me for a while longer first?" I have other patients. For a long moment he said nothing, and Elena wondered if she had misjudged him entirely, if this was the moment the mission ended before it had truly begun. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something colder and more interesting than a smile, and he sat in the leather chair by the window, rolling up his sleeve, without being asked. Dr. Reyes used to bring an assistant, he said. Someone to hold his instruments so his hands didn't shake around me. I don't shake. She said it as she pressed the stethoscope's cold disc to his chest, and if her pulse was hammering beneath her calm exterior, she made absolutely certain he never heard it in her voice. Breathe normally, please. He breathed. She listened, and beneath the practiced rhythm of a healthy heart, she heard something else entirely. A faint, irregular flutter. A whisper of arrhythmia that shouldn't exist in a man his age with no history of cardiac disease before 3 years ago. 3 years ago. Around the same time, Sophia had started at Graziosa. Your heart, Elena said slowly, choosing each word like she was diffusing something live, has an irregularity that's inconsistent with your age and your file. When did your symptoms first present? Domenico's eyes went very still, the way a man's eyes go still right before he decides whether to trust you or destroy you. 3 years ago, he said. Not long after I met a woman who asked me exactly the same question, in exactly that voice. He tilted his head, studying her with new and dangerous interest. You have her eyes, Dottoressa. Has anyone told you that? The stethoscope nearly slipped from Elena's fingers. I don't know what you mean, she managed. Don't you? He rose from the chair, close enough now that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the exact moment suspicion sharpened into something else in the pale grey of his eyes. Sophia Rossi. She sat exactly where you're standing 3 years ago, and told me my heart was lying to me. His voice dropped, quiet and lethal. You have her exact eyes, Dottoressa Moretti. I find that a very interesting coincidence for a woman who claims to have no connection to this house at all. Elena's blood turned to ice water in her veins, and somewhere beneath the fear, a colder, sharper feeling took root. He had known Sophia, he had loved Sophia, and he had just proven in one sentence that he missed nothing. She was going to have to be very, very careful. I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Falcone, she said, meeting his eyes without blinking, because the only way to survive a man like this was to never let him see you flinch. But I assure you, I'm only here to keep your heart beating. His smile, when it finally came, held no warmth at all. We'll see, Dottoressa, he said softly. We'll see. She didn't sleep that night. Elena lay in the small studio apartment the bureau had rented for her under the Moretti name, sparse, anonymous, chosen specifically because it looked like nothing worth remembering, and stared at the ceiling while Domenico Falcone's voice echoed through her skull. You have her exact eyes. She had known, going in, that resemblance was a risk. She and Sophia had shared their mother's face, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same habit of tilting their chin up when they were about to say something they knew would get them in trouble. She had told herself the risk was manageable. People saw what they expected to see, and no one expected Sophia Rossi's baby sister to be standing in a Mafia don's study wearing another dead woman's medical license. She had been wrong. Domenico Falcone did not see what he expected to see. He saw everything. At 3 a.m., unable to lie still any longer, Elena pulled out the burner laptop hidden inside a false-bottom drawer and opened the files she'd smuggled out of Sophia's old apartment before the landlord cleared it. Boxes of notebooks, a laptop the police had somehow overlooked, years of Sophia's handwriting that Elena had read so many times she could recite entire pages from memory. She found the entry again, the one she'd flagged in her mind the moment Domenico said his name. DF, cardiac irregularity, no prior history, presenting 3 months post-transition to home nursing care under family supervision. Labs inconsistent with clinical presentation. Something isn't matching. Will run independent panel, Thursday, off the books. Below it, 2 weeks later, in handwriting that had begun to slant with urgency. Confirmed trace levels inconsistent with prescribed medication. This isn't a side effect. This is deliberate. I don't know who yet. I can't tell D, not until I'm certain, not until I know he'll believe me over his own blood. And the final entry, 3 days before Sophia died, written so hastily the ink had smeared where her hand must have dragged across the page. I know who. I have proof. I'm telling him tomorrow night. If anything happens to me, look at the Falcone family ledgers. Look at who benefits from D staying sick. Look at who benefits from D dying slow instead of fast. It's cleaner that way. It looks natural. No one asks questions about a chronic illness the way they'd ask about a bullet. I love him. God help me, I love him, and I think that's going to get me killed. Eleanor closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, her sister's last words burning behind her closed eyes. Sophia hadn't killed herself. Sophia had discovered someone in Domenico Falcone's own family was poisoning him, slowly, methodically, disguising murder as illness, and she had died the night before she was going to tell him. Someone had found out. Someone had silenced her, staged a suicide clean enough to fool the police and clean enough, apparently, to fool Domenico Falcone himself. Which meant Eleanor wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. She was walking into a house where the killer still lived, still smiled at family dinners, still had access to the same man she was now, terrifyingly responsible for keeping alive. The next morning, Elena requested Domenico's full medication history from Grazioso's records department. A request routine enough not to raise flags, buried inside a stack of other administrative paperwork she filed before her shift even started. What she found confirmed everything Sophia had suspected, and worse. 3 medications prescribed by Dr. Reyes over the past 18 months contained a compound that, in isolation, looked innocuous. A common cardiac stabilizer used in half the hospital's patients. But cross-referenced against Domenico's actual symptoms, against labs that showed liver stress inconsistent with the dosages on record, against a pattern of subtle escalation timed suspiciously around specific family events. It wasn't medicine. It was murder. Administered 1 careful milligram at a time, slow enough to look like decline, patient enough to never raise suspicion, cruel enough that the man being killed had no idea he was dying by design instead of by chance. Someone close to Domenico, someone with access to his medical file, his private nursing staff, his home visits, was killing him the same way, using the same patience, the same precision Sophia had discovered and died trying to expose. Elena thought of Dr. Reyes's sudden, unexplained retirement. She thought of Carmela's warning, he liked the last one even less at the end, and wondered, with a chill that settled deep into her bones, whether Reyes had started asking the same questions Sophia had and simply gotten lucky enough to walk away instead of getting silenced. She thought of her sister's final words. "I love him. I think that's going to get me killed." Elena had come to Grazioso to find her sister's killer. She hadn't expected to find, standing directly in the crossfire, a man Sophia had loved enough to die trying to save. She closed the file, squared her shoulders, and made herself a second promise, to sit beside the first. I will not let it happen twice. She had no idea, not yet, how impossible that promise would prove to keep, or how the man she was trying to save would become the only thing standing between her and the same fate that had claimed her sister. The invitation arrived by hand, delivered by a man in a black suit who didn't wait for a reply, because, as he informed Elena flatly, Mr. Falcone doesn't request, he informs. Sunday dinner, 7 o'clock, family only, and his physician by his particular instruction. Elena stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, deciding what a woman wore to dinner with the family that might be killing the man she was falling into orbit around, before she caught herself and dressed the way Dr. Moretti would dress, professional, understated, a dark green dress that said, I belong in this room, but I'm not trying to impress anyone in it. Because trying too hard was its own kind of confession. The Falcone dining room could have hosted a state banquet. 12 people sat around a table long enough to require raised voices at either end, beneath a chandelier that threw fractured light across faces Elena had spent the drive over memorizing from surveillance photos in her case file. Vittoria Falcone, Domenico's aunt, seated at the foot of the table like a queen who resented not being at the head of it, sharp-eyed, exquisitely dressed, the kind of woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived every rumour about how. Marco Falcone, Domenico's younger cousin, handsome in a soft, unfinished way, drinking too fast and laughing too loud, the kind of man who wanted power he hadn't yet earned the patience to hold. And beside him, quiet, watchful, a woman introduced as Isabella, Marco's wife, who said almost nothing throughout the entire meal, but whose eyes tracked every movement at the table like she was taking inventory. Domenico sat at the head, and when Elena entered, his gaze found her before she'd even crossed the threshold, tracking her the way a man tracks something he intends to keep. Dottoressa. He rose, an old-world courtesy that startled her, that seemed to startle the rest of the table too, judging by the flicker of glances exchanged down the length of it. You came. You informed me, Mr. Falcone. I didn't think refusal was an option. Something that might have been a real smile passed over his mouth before he caught it and put it away. Sit. Beside me. The seat placed her directly across from Vittoria, whose eyes had not left Elena's face since she'd entered the room. Dr. Moretti, Vittoria said, once the first course had been cleared, her voice smooth as poured wine and twice as dangerous. Domenico tells me you replaced dear Dr. Reyes rather suddenly. He retired. Did he? Vittoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. How convenient that a man in perfect health should retire so abruptly, right when my nephew's health had finally begun to stabilize. She turned that same assessing gaze on Domenico. You have odd luck with doctors, tesoro. First that Rossi girl, tragically, now this sudden retirement. One wonders. The room went very quiet. Elena felt every eye at the table shift toward her, and understood, with cold clarity, that this was a test, that Vittoria had said Sophia's name deliberately, watching to see how the new doctor would react to it. Elena kept her face perfectly, professionally still. "I'm sorry, I don't know that name." "No reason you should." Domenico's voice cut in, low and final, closing the subject the way a door closes on a room no one is permitted to enter. He didn't look at his aunt when he said it. He looked at Elena, and something passed behind his pale eyes that she couldn't quite name. Grief, maybe, worn so long it had calcified into something closer to armour. It's not a dinner conversation. Vittoria's mouth thinned, but she said nothing further, turning her attention instead to Marco, needling him about a shipment that had apparently gone missing off a dock in Red Hook, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations at dangerous tables always moved on, smooth on the surface, knives sheathed, but never far from reach beneath it. Elena spent the rest of the dinner cataloguing. Marco drank 4 glasses of wine and grew louder with each one, resentful undertones surfacing about family business decisions he clearly felt excluded from. Isabella watched her husband with an expression Elena couldn't read. Not quite love, not quite contempt. Something exhausted in between. Vittoria presided over the table like she was still waiting for someone to formally hand her the throne she believed should have been hers instead of her nephew's. And Domenico said little, ate less, and watched everyone at his own table with the wary precision of a man who had learned the hard way that the people most likely to kill you were the ones who called you tesoro and passed you the bread. When dinner ended and the family scattered into the house's other wings, Domenico caught Elena's wrist before she could follow the others out, his grip gentle but immovable, his thumb resting against her pulse point like he was checking it without a stethoscope. "You're a good liar, dottoressa," he said quietly, once they were alone in the hallway, candlelight throwing his face into planes of gold and shadow. "You didn't even blink when my aunt said her name." Eleanor's heart slammed once hard against her ribs. "I told you. I don't know. I know you're lying." His voice dropped lower, and he stepped closer, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, despite the January chill seeping through the mansion's ancient walls. "I don't yet know why, but I intend to find out, Elena." A pause, deliberate, weighted. "That is your real name, isn't it? Elena?" The floor seemed to drop away beneath her. "How did you—" "You said it in your sleep," he said, and something dark and possessive moved behind his eyes. "The night you fell asleep in the chair beside my bed during my last checkup. You didn't notice. I did." His thumb traced once, slow and deliberate, along the inside of her wrist. "I notice everything about the women who lie to me in my own house, dottoressa. It's kept me alive this long." Elena stood frozen, every carefully constructed layer of her cover suddenly feeling paper-thin, while Domenico Falcone watched her with the patient, terrible attention of a man who had already decided he wasn't going to let her walk away. Not from this house, and not, she understood with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, from him. Elena didn't run. Running would have confirmed everything. Instead, she pulled her wrist gently but firmly from his grip and took a single step back, putting professional distance between them. Like a wall, she was rebuilding brick by brick in real time. My name is Elena Moretti. If you have concerns about my qualifications, Mr. Falcone, I'd suggest raising them with Dr. Greco, rather than cornering me in a hallway. For a moment, something almost like respect moved across his face, the look of a man watching an opponent refuse to fold under pressure, and finding the refusal more interesting than the surrender would have been. Cornering, he repeated, testing the word. Is that what this feels like to you? You're standing very close, Mr. Falcone. I am. He didn't move back. If anything, something in his posture settled, like a man who had decided the distance suited him fine. You'll forgive me. In my experience, people don't lie about small things without a reason large enough to be worth the risk. I find myself curious what yours is. Curiosity killed several cats, from what I understand. It also solved a great many murders. His eyes didn't leave hers. I find I have a talent for it. Solving things people would prefer stayed buried. Elena held his gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say, and after a long, taut moment, Domenico finally stepped back, releasing her from the orbit of his attention like a held breath finally exhaled. Your next visit is Thursday, he said, his voice returning to something colder, more businesslike, though the pale fire in his eyes hadn't fully banked. I expect you'll have thought of a better answer by then. She left the Falcone estate with her hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive back into the city, and it took her 3 attempts to get the key into her apartment door. She didn't see him again until Thursday, and in the days between, Elena did the only thing that made sense to a woman balanced on a wire above a drop she couldn't survive. She worked. She requested access to Grazioso's home nursing rotation logs, cross-referencing every nurse who had visited the Falcone estate over the past 18 months against staff schedules, against who had access to Domenico's medication cabinet, against who might have had reason to slip a compound into a bottle no one would ever think to test twice. The pattern that emerged made her blood run cold. Every escalation in Domenico's symptoms correlated almost perfectly with the visits of a single home care nurse, a woman named Renata Bianchi, who, Elena discovered after an hour of careful digging through employment records that should have taken far more clearance to access than Elena technically possessed, had been recommended for the position 18 months ago by Vittoria Falcone. Elena sat back in her chair, the pieces settling into place with the particular sickening clarity of a puzzle finally resolving into a picture no one wanted to see. Vittoria, the aunt who resented that the throne had passed to her nephew instead of to her own bloodline. Vittoria, who had personally vouched for the nurse, whose visits lined up, appointment for appointment, with every documented spike in the poison's trace levels in Domenico's blood. Vittoria, who had looked Elena dead in the eye at dinner and said Sofia Rossi's name like she was testing a blade against skin, gauging whether it would cut. It fit too well to be coincidence. And if it was true, if Vittoria Falcone had been slowly poisoning her own nephew for 18 months, hoping to install her own bloodline, likely Marco, malleable and resentful and easy to manipulate, at the head of the family, then Sofia hadn't just discovered a poisoning plot. She had discovered who, specifically, was responsible for it. A woman with the resources, the motive, and the coldness to have a young doctor silenced the moment she got too close to proving it. Eleanor thought of the note in her sister's handwriting, the one the police had filed as a suicide confession. "I'm sorry. I couldn't do this anymore." She thought of how perfectly it had been forged, how completely it had fooled everyone except the sister who'd read Sophia's real handwriting for 26 years and known, in her gut, from the very first moment she saw it, that something about the loops of the letters was subtly, unmistakably wrong. Vittoria Falcone had killed her sister. And Elena was going to have to sit across a dinner table from that woman again, smile, pass the bread, and pretend she didn't already know. She closed her laptop and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Exhaustion and grief and a rage so total it frightened her, all warring for space in her chest. "I know who now, Sophia," she thought, and for the first time in 8 months she let herself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she'd allowed herself at the funeral in front of witnesses, but the ugly, gasping kind that came from somewhere far too deep to perform. "I know who did this to you. I'm going to make her pay for it. But I have to find a way to save him first, because you loved him enough to die keeping his secret. And God help me, I think I understand why." Thursday arrived, wrapped in sleet, the kind of grey New York sky that made the whole city look like it was holding its breath. Elena arrived at the Falcone estate with a case full of equipment and a head full of half-formed plans, none of which felt adequate to the size of what she now knew. She couldn't accuse Vittoria outright, not without proof solid enough to survive whatever legal or extrajudicial reckoning followed, not without risking her own life the exact way Sophia had risked and lost hers. She needed evidence, she needed time, and she needed, desperately, to keep Domenico Falcone alive long enough to get both. He was waiting for her in the study again, but something in the air between them had shifted since the hallway, since he'd said her real name like a secret he intended to keep and use in equal measure. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed, watching her set up her equipment with hands that, for the first time since she'd arrived at Grazioso, actually did shake, just slightly, just enough that she hoped he wouldn't notice. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "Rough week," she said. "Sit," he said, and when she looked up, startled, he gestured to the chair across from his own. "Not to examine me, just sit, for a moment." "Mr. Falcone, I have a job to do." "Domenico." His voice was quiet. "If you're going to lie to me in my own house, Elena, you can at least use my first name while you do it." She sat. The chair was closer to him than her equipment required, close enough that she could see, in the grey afternoon light, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been visible in the warmer light of the dining room. The marks of a man who slept badly, and had for a long time. "Tell me about her," Elena said, before she could stop herself, before the careful, professional part of her brain could override the part that needed, desperately, to hear him say her sister's name with love in it, rather than suspicion. "Sophia. Tell me about Sophia Rossi." Something moved through his face, grief, unguarded for just a moment before he caught it and folded it away. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you keep looking at me like you're seeing a ghost. and I'd rather understand why than keep being frightened of it." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the window, at the sleet streaking grey lines down the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful edges. "She was my doctor, 3 years ago. My family insisted on a specialist for my heart, an irregularity that appeared out of nowhere, no history, no explanation. Sophia was young, brilliant, entirely unimpressed by my name or my money or the men who follow me everywhere I go." A ghost of a smile. "She told me, the first time we met, that my heart sounded like it belonged to a man twice my age who'd spent his life doing something very stupid. I told her that was, unfortunately, an accurate description." "And you fell in love with her?" "I fell in love with the fact that she wasn't afraid of me." His eyes found Elena's, and the resemblance that had haunted him since the moment she walked into this room seemed to settle over his face like a physical weight. "You have the same quality. It's disorienting." "What happened to her?" Elena asked, though she already knew, though she had read the file 100 times, because she needed to hear his version, needed to know how much he'd been told and how much had been hidden from him too. "They told me she killed herself." His jaw tightened, and for a moment the cold, controlled mask he wore slipped entirely, revealing something raw and furious underneath. "I didn't believe it. I still don't. Sophia wasn't a woman who gave up on anything, on anyone. She'd told me, days before she died, that she'd found something about my treatment that troubled her. She wanted to be certain before she told me what." His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, had curled into fists. "I never got to hear what it was. And by the time I demanded answers, the case was closed, the note was found, and everyone in my family agreed it was best to let a grieving man mourn instead of investigate." Everyone in his family. Elena filed that away, cold and precise, even as her heart broke a little further for the man in front of her, for the love he'd lost and never been allowed to properly grieve, let alone avenge. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything in 6 months of careful, practiced lies. "Why does that sound like more than sympathy, Dottoressa?" Elena's breath caught. She was standing at the edge of the truth, close enough to fall in, and some reckless, grief-worn part of her wanted to tell him everything, her name, her sister, the poison in his blood, the aunt sitting at his own table who had likely ordered both their deaths. But it was too soon. She had no proof yet strong enough to survive the fallout, and if she was wrong about timing, if she moved before she was ready, she would end up exactly where Sophia had ended up. Silenced, buried, another tragedy the Falcone family absorbed and moved past. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone and never get the truth," she said instead, which was true enough to sound like honesty. "It stays with you." Domenico studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his pale eyes, and then he reached out, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her cheekbone, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with everything she knew about the man he was supposed to be. "You're a strange comfort, Dottoressa Moretti," he said quietly. "I don't know yet whether that makes you dangerous to me or the opposite." Both, Elena thought, her pulse hammering beneath his fingertips. "I am both. and God help us both when you finally find out how much. 2 weeks passed in careful, dangerous rhythm. Checkups that stretched longer than medically necessary, conversations that circled closer to truths neither of them was ready to name, a tension between them that thickened every time they were in the same room, until it felt like something Elena could reach out and touch. She told herself it was strategy. Staying close to Domenico kept her close to the investigation, close to whatever proof she needed to build against Vittoria. She told herself a great many things in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come, and believed fewer and fewer of them with each passing day. The invitation to Bella Morte, the nightclub the Falcone family owned in the meatpacking district, a glittering, velvet-walled kingdom where half of New York's underworld conducted business behind the cover of bottle service and base, came the same way every Falcone invitation came, as an instruction, not a request. "Family event," Domenico said, when he called her personally, his voice low and warm through the phone in a way that made her stomach do something she refused to name. "Marco's engagement announcement. I need my doctor present. My heart's been unpredictable lately." "Your heart's been fine for 2 weeks," Elena said, unable to fully suppress her smile. "Then perhaps I need you present for other reasons," he said, and hung up before she could formulate a response to that. She wore black, not because she wanted to impress him, she told herself, though the lie felt thinner every time she repeated it, and arrived at Bella Morte to find the club transformed into something between a fashion show and a war council. The Falcone family and their associates gathered beneath low, gold light, while a DJ spun something moody and expensive-sounding over the speakers. Marco's engagement was, predictably, to a woman connected to a rival family from New Jersey, a merger of blood dressed up as romance, the way these things always were in circles like this. Isabella stood beside her husband with a champagne glass she wasn't drinking from, her expression unreadable as ever, and Vittoria held court near the bar, resplendent in emerald silk, accepting congratulations for an engagement that consolidated exactly the kind of power a woman like her would want consolidated. Elena found Domenico at a private table on the club's upper level, removed enough from the crowd to watch it without being fully part of it. The posture, she realized, of a man who trusted almost no one in the room below. "You came," he said, echoing the same words he'd used the night of the family dinner, and something in the repetition felt deliberate, like he was building a private language out of the smallest phrases. "You said you needed a doctor present." I lied. He said it without shame, watching her over the rim of a glass of scotch he'd barely touched. "I wanted you here. There's a difference, and I think you know it." Before Eleanor could answer, a man approached the table, younger, sharply dressed, with the loose, confident swagger of someone who had never once in his life doubted his own charm. He introduced himself as Alessandro, a cousin on Vittoria's side, and made no effort to hide the way his eyes travelled over Elena with open, appreciative interest. "Dottoressa," he said, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips before she could pull it back. "Domenico's keeping you all to himself, I see. Rude, considering how many of us have been dying to meet the woman who's finally gotten our reclusive Don to leave his study." "Alessandro." Domenico's voice had dropped several degrees, quiet and cold enough that the temperature at the table seemed to physically change. "Just being friendly, cugino." Alessandro's grin didn't falter, but he released Elena's hand, taking a half-step back that read less like courtesy and more like calculated retreat. Dottoressa, if you ever get tired of playing nurse to this old grump, you know where to find me. He left with a wink, and Elena turned back to find Domenico's jaw set in a hard, dangerous line, his eyes tracking Alessandro's retreat across the club with an intensity that bordered on violent. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said carefully. "Do what?" "Whatever that was. She gestured vaguely. "The glaring." "I wasn't glaring." He reached for his scotch and finally drank, his knuckles white around the glass. "I was considering how difficult it would be to explain a body in my own nightclub during my cousin's engagement party." Elena laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the first genuine one she'd allowed herself in weeks. "You're jealous." "I don't get jealous." His eyes cut back to hers, and whatever careful control he usually wore had slipped, just slightly, just enough to show her something raw underneath. Jealousy implies uncertainty about what belongs to me. I don't experience uncertainty, Dottoressa. I don't belong to anyone, Domenico. Not yet, he agreed, and the quiet, absolute certainty in his voice sent something hot and terrified through her chest in equal measure. He set down his glass and reached across the table, his fingers closing gently around her wrist, the same gesture from the hallway, familiar now, dangerous in a new and different way. But I find I'm a patient man when the prize is worth the wait. Below them, the party roared on, oblivious, while Vittoria Falcone raised a toast to her son's engagement with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and Elena sat frozen in the grip of a man she was falling for, despite every warning bell in her mind, in a club owned by the family that had killed her sister, holding a secret large enough to burn the entire glittering room to the ground. She thought, not for the first time, that she was in far too deep to find her way back out clean. She thought, for the first time, that she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. The break came from an unlikely source, Renata Bianchi's own conscience, or what remained of it. Elena had spent 3 weeks building a quiet surveillance file on the home care nurse, cross-referencing shift logs, tracking pharmacy withdrawal records against actual dosages administered, documenting a pattern of discrepancy too consistent to be clerical error. What she needed was a confession, or documentation solid enough to function as one, and nurses under this kind of pressure, Elena had learned in her federal training, eventually cracked in one of 2 ways. They doubled down, or they broke. Renata broke on a Tuesday afternoon, cornered in the Grazioso staff break room with nothing more threatening than a cup of coffee and Elena's quiet, unhurried patience. "I know what's in the medication you've been administering to Mr. Falcone," Elena said, keeping her voice low, conversational, the way she'd been trained to extract information from frightened people without ever raising her voice. "I know it's not what's on his chart." Renata's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I think you've known for a long time, and I think it's been eating you alive." Elena slid into the seat across from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to not feel like a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you, Renata. I'm here because a doctor died 3 years ago for finding out the same thing you know. I don't want you to be next. The colour drained from Renata's face. Sophia Rossi. You knew her. I know what happened to her. Renata's hands were shaking now, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup. I've known for months what I was doing. What I was putting in his IV lines during home visits. I told myself it was just a stabilizer, that maybe I was wrong about the levels. But I wasn't wrong, was I? I've been poisoning him. Her voice cracked. I didn't have a choice. Vittoria Falcone doesn't give you a choice. She knows things. About my brother. About a debt he owes people I can't afford to have found out. She said if I refused, she'd make sure he disappeared instead. There it was. Confirmation, spoken aloud from the hand that had administered it. I need you to write that down, Elena said gently. Everything. The compound, the dosages, when Vittoria approached you, what she threatened you with. I can protect you, Renata, but only if you help me stop this before it goes any further. Renata wept, quiet and broken, but she wrote it all down. 3 pages in shaking handwriting that detailed 18 months of coerced poisoning, of a woman terrified into complicity by threats against her family, of a slow, patient murder disguised as chronic illness. It wasn't enough to take to the police, not yet. Not against a family with Vittoria's resources and reach, not without exposing Elena's own false identity in the process. But it was enough to bring to the one person who could actually act on it with the force required to make it matter. It was enough to finally tell Domenico the truth. She found him alone in his study that evening, the same room where this entire impossible tangle had begun, and for the first time in months, Elena Rossi let herself walk into a room as exactly who she was. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you react. Something in her tone made him set down the papers he'd been reading, his full attention turning to her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. You're frightening me, Dottoressa. That's not a small accomplishment. My name isn't Elena Moretti. She watched his face carefully as she said it, watched every muscle go taut. It's Elena Rossi. Sophia Rossi was my sister. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a gunshot. Total, absolute, the whole room holding its breath. Say that again, he said very quietly. Sophia was my sister. She didn't kill herself, Domenico. She was murdered because she found out someone in your family has been poisoning you for 3 years, slowly, through your medication. And she was about to tell you the truth the night she died. Elena's voice broke, months of grief finally cracking through the careful professional mask she'd worn since the day she buried her sister. I came here to find out who killed her. I found out weeks ago. I have a confession from the nurse who's been administering the poison and a name of who's been forcing her to do it. Domenico had gone entirely, terrifyingly still. Who? Domenico? Who, Elena? She held his gaze and delivered the truth she'd been carrying like a loaded weapon for 3 weeks. Your aunt. Vittoria has been poisoning you since before Sophia died. She's the reason my sister is dead, and I think she means to finish what she started. With you. The rage that moved through Domenico Falcone's face in that moment was unlike anything Elena had ever witnessed. Cold, absolute, the fury of a man discovering that the woman who had raised him, who had sat at his table for 30 years calling him tesoro, had spent the last 3 of them slowly, patiently trying to kill him, and had murdered the woman he loved to keep the secret buried. "Show me everything," he said, his voice a low, lethal calm that frightened her more than shouting would have. "Every file, every page." "And then, Elena." His eyes found hers, blazing with grief and fury, and something else entirely, something that had been building between them for weeks and had just cracked wide open. "Then you're going to tell me why you let me fall in love with you before you told me the truth." Eleanor spread the files across his desk with hands that had finally stopped shaking, because the fear that had governed every interaction since she'd walked into Grazioso 6 weeks ago had burned away, leaving only exhaustion and a terrible, aching relief at finally being known. Domenico read everything in silence. Sophia's journal entries, the lab discrepancies, Renata's confession, the employment records tracing back to Vittoria's recommendation. His face a mask of controlled fury that grew colder and more precise with every page, the way a man's face goes still right before he decides exactly how someone is going to die. 3 years, he said finally, staring at Sophia's last journal entry, the one about telling him the truth the night she never got the chance to. 3 years, and no one told me. My own family let me believe I was simply ill, let me mourn a woman they'd murdered, and called it grief for a suicide. His hand had curled into a fist against the desk, the wood creaking under the pressure. "I sat across from my aunt at dinner 2 weeks ago. I let her pour my wine." "Domenico, don't." His voice wasn't unkind, but it was raw, stripped of every careful layer he usually wore. "I need a moment, please." Elena gave it to him, stood in silence while he processed grief 3 years old and rage that had finally found its proper target, while the man she'd watched build careful walls around himself for weeks let them come down in front of her, unguarded, for the first time. "I loved her," he said finally, quietly, staring at Sophia's handwriting. "I want you to know that. Whatever else is true, I loved your sister. I would have married her if she'd let me. I asked her, you know, a month before she died. She said she needed time." His voice broke just slightly, just enough. "I've spent 3 years thinking she said no because she didn't love me enough. She was protecting me. She died protecting me, and I never even knew to thank her for it." "She loved you too," Elena said softly, and meant it. Could see it in every frantic, frightened, devoted line of Sophia's final journal entries. She wasn't going to let anyone hurt you, not even at the cost of her own life. Domenico looked up at her then, something raw and searching in his pale eyes. "And you? You came here to find her killer. You found her. What happens now, Elena? Do you walk away, mission complete, and let the federal system you work for handle the rest? Through proper channels that will take years, and likely fail against a family with our resources?" He shook his head slowly. "Or do you let me handle this, the way things are actually handled in my world?" Elena hesitated. Everything in her training told her the answer. Evidence, legal process, a case built carefully enough to survive appeal. But everything in her, the sister who had buried Sophia in a dress the wrong colour for how much she'd wanted to scream, wanted something faster, something final. I want her to face justice, Elena said carefully. I don't care what form it takes anymore. I stopped caring the day I read Renata's confession and realized my sister died for nothing. That Vittoria's been sitting at your table for 3 years, pretending to love you, while poisoning your blood one careful drop at a time. That's not the answer of a federal agent, Domenico observed quietly. No, Elena admitted. It's the answer of a sister. Something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a grief that mirrored his own. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. And I need the truth. Because I've had enough lies in this house to last several lifetimes. Ask. Everything between us, the checkups that ran too long, the way you laughed at Bella Morte, the way you've looked at me the last 3 weeks like you were fighting something you didn't want to feel. Was any of it real? Or was I simply a mission, Elena, a means to get close enough to find what you needed? The question hung in the air between them, and Elena understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment that mattered more than any evidence file, any confession, any careful plan for exposing Vittorio Falcone's crimes. This was the moment that determined whether everything that came after would be built on truth or on the same kind of careful lie that had gotten her sister killed. It started as a mission, she admitted quietly. I won't lie to you about that. I came here to use you, your access, your position, your proximity to my sister's killer. That's the truth, and you deserve it. She reached up, her palm resting against his jaw, feeling the tension in it ease slightly beneath her touch. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the mission. I don't know exactly when. Maybe the night you told me about Sophia, and I watched you grieve a woman you'd loved for real. Maybe Bella Morte, when you were jealous over nothing, and I found it, infuriatingly charming instead of alarming the way it should have been. Her voice softened further. It's real, Domenico. Whatever this is between us, it's real. I didn't want it to be. It would have been so much easier if it wasn't. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face, and the kiss that followed wasn't gentle. It was 3 weeks of careful restraint finally breaking, grief and fury and desperate desire-soaked relief tangled together into something neither of them had the strength left to resist. Elena's hands found the front of his shirt and gripped like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go, and Domenico's arms wrapped around her like he intended to hold every broken piece of her together by sheer force of will. I should hate you, he murmured against her mouth, for 6 weeks of lies. You can hate me tomorrow, Elena whispered back, after we bury the woman who killed my sister. His laugh was dark and low and entirely without humour. Tomorrow, then. Tonight, Dottoressa, I have other plans for you entirely. Revenge, Elena had learned in her years with the Bureau, was rarely served hot and fast in the movies-style shootout her heart occasionally craved. It was served cold, patient, and airtight, because a woman like Vittorio Falcone, sharp enough to poison her own nephew for 3 years without detection, would not go down to anything less than a trap constructed with surgical precision. Domenico's fury had cooled, in the days that followed his confrontation with the truth, into something far more dangerous than rage, methodical, patient calculation. Elena watched him transform in front of her. The wounded man who'd broken down over Sophia's journal entries folding away entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating Don whose reputation had kept an empire intact for a decade. "We can't move against her carelessly," he said 3 days later, pacing the length of his study while Elena reviewed Renata's evidence for the dozenth time. "If we simply confront her, she'll deny everything, claim the nurse is lying under duress, produce witnesses, lawyers, alibis. My aunt has spent 30 years building contingencies for exactly this scenario. We need her to incriminate herself, on record, beyond any possibility of denial. You want to record a confession. I want her to believe she's already won," Domenico said, something cold and precise settling into his eyes. "I'm going to tell her my health is declining rapidly, that the doctors," a nod toward Elena, "believe I have weeks, not months. I'm going to tell her I'm restructuring the family's leadership in anticipation and that Marco will inherit control." Elena's stomach turned over. "You think she'll show her hand?" "I think a woman who has waited 3 years to see her bloodline take the throne will not be able to resist celebrating prematurely, in private, where she believes no one is listening." His jaw tightened. "I know my aunt, Elena, better apparently than I ever wanted to. She's patient, but she's also arrogant. She's never once in 30 years believed anyone in this family was clever enough to catch her. And if she doesn't take the bait, then we find another way." His eyes found Elena's, something protective and fierce moving behind them. "But you will not be part of whatever happens next, beyond providing the medical framework for the lie. I won't have you anywhere near Vittoria when this comes to a head. She's already killed one woman who got too close to this truth. I refuse to let her have a second chance at the only other one who matters to me." "Domenico, I'm not going to hide in a corner while you're not hiding. You're surviving." His voice hardened, the first real flash of the possessive, dangerous man beneath the grieving one. "I lost Sophia to this family's rot. I am not losing you to it as well, Elena. That is not a negotiation. That is the one place I will not bend, regardless of how furious it makes you." She wanted to argue. Every instinct that had carried her through 6 months of undercover work screamed against sitting on the sidelines of the operation that would finally deliver justice for her sister. But something in the raw, absolute fear beneath his fury stopped her. The recognition that this wasn't controlling possessiveness for its own sake, but the desperate protectiveness of a man who had already buried one woman he loved to this exact family and could not survive doing it twice. "Fine," she said quietly, "but I want to be there when she's caught, even if I'm not part of setting the trap." "When she's caught," Domenico said, something dark and certain in his voice, "you will be the first person I call." The plan unfolded over the following week with the careful patience of a chess match played by someone who had never once lost. Domenico staged a decline, convincing enough to fool the household, visibly tired, cancelling meetings, murmuring in low, worried tones to his closest lieutenants about restructuring the family's future. He met privately with Marco, informing him with apparent reluctant resignation that leadership would need to pass to him sooner than anyone expected. Marco, to his credit, seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the news, a small mercy that suggested at least one member of the Falcone family hadn't been complicit in the plot against its head. But Vittoria, when Domenico relayed the same information to her over a private dinner rigged with recording equipment hidden inside a floral centerpiece Elena had personally selected and wired herself, could not entirely hide the flicker of triumph beneath her carefully performed concern. "You mustn't speak that way, tesoro," Vittoria said, her voice thick with false sympathy. "You're still young. There's still hope." "The doctors don't think so," Domenico said, his own performance flawless, grief and resignation woven through every word. "I've made peace with it. I only want to ensure the family is protected, whatever comes." "Of course." Vittoria reached across the table and covered his hand with her own, and Elena, watching the feed from a car parked 3 blocks away, felt her stomach twist at the woman's audacity, comforting the nephew she'd spent 3 years poisoning, her touch gentle, her eyes calculating. "You've always been a good boy, Domenico. Your mother would be so proud of how you've carried this family. Whatever happens, know that I'll make certain it continues exactly as it should." It wasn't a confession. Not yet. But it was close enough, cold enough, that Elena's hands curled into fists in the dark of the surveillance van. Rage and grief tangled together as she watched the woman who'd killed her sister perform grief for a murder she was actively still committing. "Soon," Elena promised silently, watching Vittoria's calm, satisfied face on the small screen. "Soon, you're going to understand exactly what it feels like to lose everything you've spent your whole life building." She had no idea, watching that screen in the cold dark of the surveillance van, how soon her own reckoning was coming too, or how close she already stood to becoming Vittoria's next and final target. Elena's own checkups began the following week, a small, seemingly innocuous suggestion from Carmela, delivered with the same warm, matronly concern she'd shown from the very first day. "You work so hard, Dottoressa," Carmela said, setting a cup of tea in front of Elena in the estate's kitchen. "Always looking after everyone else. Signora Falcone insists we look after you too. She's arranged for Renata to run a basic wellness panel, nothing invasive, just routine blood work, considering how many hours you've been keeping at this house." Elena's instincts screamed a warning, even as her professional face remained perfectly, carefully neutral. "That's very generous. I didn't realize Vittoria concerned herself with the staff's welfare." "Oh, she's very particular about the people close to Domenico," Carmela said, and something in the way she said it, careful, weighted, a warning disguised as pleasantry, made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise. Especially now, with his health the way it is. Elena agreed to the wellness panel with a smile that cost her more than she let show, and immediately, the moment she was alone, called Domenico. "She's targeting me," Elena said without preamble the moment he picked up. "Vittoria's arranged for Renata to run blood work on me, under the guise of concern for the hard-working doctor." Silence stretched on the line, taut and dangerous. "Elena, listen to me very carefully. Do not let anyone administer anything to you, not medication, not vitamins, not so much as an aspirin, until this is finished. Do you understand me?" "I understand." Elena's pulse hammered. "But if she's already moving against me, Domenico, that means she suspects. She knows something's wrong. We need to accelerate the plan before she—" "I know." His voice had gone hard, cold, the sound of a man calculating rapidly under pressure. "I'll speak to Renata tonight. I need to know exactly what Vittoria has ordered, and I need to know now." Renata, when Domenico found her that evening, was shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup steady, the same tremor Elena had witnessed weeks earlier in the Grazioso break room, except now it was directed at the man whose life she'd been slowly ending for 18 months. "She wants me to start Dr. Moretti, Elena, on the same compound," Renata confessed, tears streaking down her face as Domenico stood over her, his fury banked but unmistakable. "Small doses, gradual escalation, disguised as a vitamin supplement in the wellness panel," Vittoria said. Renata's voice broke. "She said history has a way of repeating itself when a doctor gets too close to the family's business. She said she'd rather not repeat old mistakes twice, but she would if she had to." The confirmation landed like a physical blow. Vittoria hadn't merely suspected Eleanor of something. She knew, or suspected strongly enough to act, that Eleanor posed the same threat Sophia once had, and she was prepared to eliminate that threat using the exact same method, disguised the exact same way, betting that lightning would strike twice and no one would ever question a second young doctor's tragic decline. "How long?" Domenico asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Before the dosage would become lethal?" "At the escalation rate she specified." Renata's hands shook harder. 6 weeks. Maybe less, if she decided to accelerate it the way she did with you toward the end. 6 weeks. Elena had 6 weeks before the woman who'd killed her sister succeeded in killing her too, using an identical method, an identical betrayal of medical trust, an identical cold, patient cruelty. Domenico found Elena that night in her apartment, arriving without warning, his composure cracking the moment the door closed behind him. "I want you out of this house," he said, without greeting, without preamble, crossing the small apartment in 3 long strides to grip her shoulders like he needed physical proof she was still standing in front of him, still breathing. "Out of the investigation, out of Grazioso, somewhere safe, somewhere she can't reach you, until this is finished." "Domenico, I watched her kill your sister without ever laying a hand on her," he said, his voice raw. "One careful, patient dose at a time, disguised as care, as medicine, as concern. I am not watching her do the same thing to you. I refuse. If I disappear now, she'll know something's wrong. She'll destroy the evidence, disappear, and we'll lose any chance of justice. For Sophia, for you, for every year she's poisoned this family from the inside." Elena reached up, covering his hands where they gripped her shoulders, feeling the tremor running through him. "I need to finish this. I need to see it through. And if you die finishing it, then at least I'll die knowing she doesn't win." Elena's voice cracked, months of grief and fear finally breaking through. "I've spent 8 months chasing my sister's ghost through this city, Domenico. I am not stopping 6 weeks before I finally catch the woman who killed her, not even to save my own life." Domenico stared at her for a long, silent moment, something fierce and broken and utterly devoted moving across his face. And then he pulled her against his chest, holding her like he could physically shield her from a poison already circulating, however slowly, through her blood. "Then I am not leaving your side," he said into her hair, his voice fierce with a vow he clearly intended to keep at any cost. "Not for a single moment until this is finished. I have already buried one woman I loved to this family's rot, Elena. I will burn every single one of them to the ground before I bury a second." They moved faster after that night. The careful patience of the original plan compressed into something more urgent, more dangerous. Domenico called an emergency meeting of the family's inner circle, citing a sudden, alarming decline in his condition. Not entirely a fabrication, Elena thought grimly, given how genuinely stressed and sleepless he'd become in the days since learning about the plot against her. He announced, in front of Vittoria, Marco, and a handful of trusted capos, that he intended to step back from daily operations immediately, effective that week, with Marco assuming interim leadership under Vittoria's guidance until his health stabilized. It was bait, laid as bluntly and irresistibly as Domenico could construct it, and Elena watched from the corner of the room, where she'd been permitted to remain only as his physician, present for medical reasons, as something dark and satisfied moved beneath Vittoria's carefully composed grief. "You're doing the right thing, tesoro," Vittoria said, her voice thick with performed sorrow. "Family must come before pride. Marco will make you proud." "I hope so," Domenico said, his own performance flawless, exhausted and resigned. "I only ask one thing, Zia. Whatever happens to me, Dr. Moretti is not to be replaced. She understands my case better than anyone. I want her to continue overseeing my care until the end." Something flickered behind Vittoria's eyes. Calculation, quickly hidden, but Elena caught it from across the room, and her blood ran cold, understanding what it meant. Vittoria had already decided Elena's timeline needed to accelerate. If Domenico was insisting on keeping his new doctor close, permanently, that made Elena a fixture, a long-term risk instead of a temporary one, and long-term risks, in Vittoria Falcone's world, were dealt with faster, not slower. That night, Elena's apartment was broken into. She arrived home from a late checkup to find the door lock scratched, subtle enough that a careless eye would have missed it, obvious enough to someone trained to look. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed on the surface. But when she checked the small refrigerator where she kept a bottle of vitamins, the ones Carmela had kindly provided as part of her wellness routine, the ones Domenico had made her promise never to actually consume, the seal on the cap had been broken and carefully, almost invisibly, resealed. Elena's hands shook as she photographed the tampered bottle, sent the images to the secure federal server she still, beneath everything, maintained access to, and called Domenico with a voice she fought hard to keep steady. "She's moving faster than we planned," Elena said. "Someone's been in my apartment. The vitamins Carmela gave me have been tampered with." Domenico arrived at her apartment within 20 minutes, and the fury on his face when he examined the broken seal was unlike anything Elena had witnessed from him before. Colder than the night she'd told him the truth about Sophia, more absolute, more dangerous. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low, lethal calm. "I'm done playing patient. I'm done waiting for her to incriminate herself on a recording device. She's already tried to kill you twice in the same week. Domenico, if we move without airtight proof, she'll have every excuse to claim we're framing her out of grief and paranoia. I don't care." He gripped her hands, his own trembling with barely restrained rage. "Elena, I have already lost one woman to her patience. I will not gamble your life on the hope that she incriminates herself cleanly enough for a recording device to satisfy a courtroom that will likely never see this case anyway, given who we are and what world we live in. I have my own justice, and I intend to use it." And if that justice makes you exactly the kind of man Sophia was trying to protect you from becoming? Elena's voice was gentle but firm, cutting through his fury with the one argument she knew would actually land. She died trying to save you from a war inside your own family, Domenico. Don't let her death end with you becoming a man drowning in exactly that kind of blood. The fight went out of him slowly, reluctantly, replaced by something exhausted and grief-stricken. He sank onto the edge of Elena's small couch, his head in his hands, and for a long moment the most powerful man in New York's underworld looked, simply, like a man who had lost too much and was terrified of losing more. "I don't know how to protect you," he admitted quietly, "without becoming the kind of monster that makes protecting you meaningless." Elena knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands, forcing his eyes up to meet hers. "Then let's finish this the way Sophia would have wanted, with proof, with justice that actually holds. We're close, Domenico. Renata's confession, the recording from dinner, the tampered vitamins. It's building. We just need one more piece, something undeniable. And if we don't get it before she tries again?" Elena didn't have an answer for that. Neither of them did. They sat together in the quiet dark of her apartment, wrapped in each other. Two people who had found something real in the wreckage of a murder plot. Both painfully aware that the clock ticking toward Vittoria's next move might not give them the luxury of finishing this the careful way at all. The undeniable piece of evidence, when it finally surfaced, came from the last place Elena expected. Isabella, Marco's quiet, watchful wife, who had said almost nothing at every family gathering Elena had attended, and had, apparently, been watching everything. She approached Elena alone in the parking garage beneath Grazioso 3 days after the break-in, her usual careful composure cracked with something like desperation. "I need to talk to you," Isabella said, glancing over her shoulder like she expected to be followed. "About Vittoria." Elena's guard went up instantly. "What do you know?" "I know Marco doesn't want this." Isabella's voice shook. "Whatever Vittoria's planning, whatever she's done, Marco doesn't want it. He's weak, and he drinks too much, and he resents Domenico for reasons that have nothing to do with wanting him dead. But his mother," she swallowed hard, "his mother has been planning this for years. I've seen the ledgers. She keeps records of everything, everyone she's paid off, every debt she's called in, every threat she's used to keep people compliant. Renata isn't the only one she's controlling this way." "You have access to these ledgers?" "I've been Marco's wife for 6 years. I know where his mother hides things she thinks no one in this family is clever enough to find." Isabella's jaw tightened, old resentment surfacing beneath the fear. "She's never respected me, never thought I was worth watching carefully around. That's her mistake, not mine." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I have a daughter." Isabella's voice broke for the first time, the careful composure finally cracking entirely. 4 years old. I will not raise her in a family run by a woman willing to poison her own nephew, willing to kill a doctor in cold blood to protect that secret, and now willing to do it again to you. I've watched Vittoria my entire marriage, Dottoressa. I know exactly what she's capable of. and I refuse to let my daughter grow up believing that kind of cruelty is simply how this family survives." Isabella delivered the ledger 3 days later, smuggled out during a family lunch in a diaper bag no one thought to search, and what it contained exceeded every hope Elena had carried into this investigation. Detailed records in Vittoria's own precise handwriting spanning 3 years, payments to Renata Bianchi disguised as medical consulting fees, a payment to a forger 3 weeks before Sophia's death for services described only as documentation, urgent, discreet, a payment to a private investigator 6 weeks ago for background verification, Dr. E. Moretti, dated suspiciously close to when Vittoria had first begun probing Elena's cover at the family dinner. And, most damning of all, a single entry, dated the night before Sophia died, reading simply, S.R. Resolved. R.B. To continue as scheduled. D.F. Transition managed. It was a confession, written in the language of a woman who had never once believed anyone would find and understand it. Cold, bureaucratic, utterly without remorse, the ledger of a killer who kept her murders filed as carefully as her family's finances. Elena brought it to Domenico that night and watched him read the entry about Sophia's death in his own aunt's handwriting, watched something in him go very, very still and very, very final. "We have her," Elena said quietly. "We have her," Domenico agreed, his voice a low, cold echo of the same lethal calm she'd heard the night of the break-in, except this time backed by proof solid enough to actually end this. "Tonight. This ends tonight, Elena. I'm done waiting for her to hang herself on a recording that might never survive a courtroom neither of us actually believes we'll ever see this case. I have the proof now. I intend to use it. What are you going to do?" Domenico's pale eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd known him, Elena saw the man beneath the careful, controlled don entirely. Grief-stricken, furious, protective beyond reason, and utterly without mercy for the woman who had taken everything from him and tried, twice now, to take Elena too. "I'm going to give my aunt exactly the justice she gave your sister," he said quietly, cold, patient, and absolutely inescapable. Vittoria Falcone was summoned to the study at 9 o'clock that evening, under the pretense of discussing Marco's transition into leadership, and arrived in emerald silk with the same composed, satisfied smile she'd worn at every family gathering since Elena had first met her. The smile did not survive long. Domenico sat behind his desk, Elena standing at his side, and between them lay the ledger, Renata's written confession, and a folder of photographs documenting the tampered vitamin bottle from Elena's apartment. "Sit down, Zia," Domenico said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Vittoria's eyes moved over the evidence spread across the desk, and Elena watched, with grim satisfaction, the exact moment the woman's composure cracked. Not into panic, not yet, but into the cold, rapid calculation of someone assessing how much damage control was still possible. "I don't know what this is meant to prove," Vittoria said, sitting slowly, her spine straight, her chin lifted, in the exact same defiant tilt Elena had come to recognize as a Falcone family trait. "Ledgers can be forged. Nurses can be coerced into false confessions by anyone with enough pressure to apply. Your handwriting, Zia." Domenico's voice was quiet, lethal. "I've read your handwriting my entire life, on birthday cards, on business documents, On the letter you wrote me the day my father died, promising to always protect this family." He tapped the ledger entry documenting Sophia's death. "Explain to me how a forgery managed to replicate 30 years of your handwriting so perfectly it fooled me completely until I had a reason to actually examine it carefully." Vittoria's mouth thinned into a hard, colourless line. "You don't understand what I've had to do to protect this family, Domenico. Your father built an empire on instinct and violence. You've spent a decade trying to make it respectable, legitimate, soft. Marco understands what this family actually needs to survive. Strength, ruthlessness, the will to do what's necessary." "You poisoned me," Domenico said, his voice cracking for the first time, grief bleeding through the fury. "Slowly. For 3 years, you watched me get sicker, watched me suffer, and told me it was simply bad luck. You murdered Sophia because she was going to save my life. And now you've tried to do the same to Elena." "Sophia was a complication." Vittoria's voice had gone cold, stripped of any pretense of remorse. "A brilliant, stubborn complication who was going to destroy everything I'd built towards securing this family's future under proper leadership. I did what needed to be done. I would do it again." "Would you?" Domenico's voice was barely above a whisper now, and Elena had never, in 6 weeks of knowing this man, heard anything so terrifying. "Say that again, Zia. Tell me you'd kill her again. Tell me you'd kill Elena too, if given the chance." Something flickered in Vittoria's eyes, the first crack of genuine fear, finally understanding the precipice she stood on. "Domenico, tell me." "I did what I had to do to protect this family from a soft heart that would have gotten us all killed," Vittoria snapped, defiance overriding whatever fear had surfaced. "And I'd do it again in a heartbeat, if it meant Marco inherited a family strong enough to survive, instead of one led by a man too weak to see the poison sitting at his own table for 3 straight years." The silence that followed felt absolute. Domenico rose slowly from his chair, and Elena watched the last remnant of the careful, controlled man dissolve entirely, replaced by something ancient and terrible. The man his family and his world had made him, finally, fully unleashed. "You will confess everything to the men waiting outside this door," he said, his voice a low, final calm. "You will document every detail. Sophia's murder, the poison, the forger, every person you coerced into complicity. And then, Zia, you will disappear from this family's history entirely. No funeral, no grave anyone will ever visit. You wanted this family to understand ruthlessness. Congratulations, you finally taught me." Vittoria's composure shattered entirely, pleading and threats tangling together as 2 of Domenico's men entered at his signal and led her from the room, her voice echoing down the hallway long after the door closed behind her, growing fainter and finally gone. Elena stood in the sudden silence of the study, her sister's killer finally facing the reckoning that had been 8 months and 3 years in the making, and felt no triumph at all, only a hollow, exhausted grief, and the weight of Domenico's hand finding hers, gripping it like an anchor in the aftermath of a storm neither of them had fully survived unscathed. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's over," Eleanor agreed, though something in her chest, a doctor's instinct, a lingering unease she couldn't name, whispered that it wasn't quite finished yet. Not entirely. Not while the poison Vittoria had ordered for her still circulated, however slowly, however carefully disguised, through her own blood. The days that followed Vittoria's disappearance from Falcone family life passed in a strange, suspended calm. The particular quiet that follows violence, when the body keeps expecting another blow that never comes. Marco, stunned and shaken by his mother's confession, ceded any claim to leadership without argument, retreating instead into a quiet, guilt-ridden distance from family business entirely. Isabella, freed from the shadow of a mother-in-law who had never respected her, seemed to stand taller with each passing day, her daughter finally safe from the rot Vittoria had spent years cultivating. Renata, granted protection and immunity in exchange for her testimony, disappeared into a witness protection arrangement Elena's still active federal connections quietly facilitated, a small mercy for a woman who had been more victim than villain in the scheme that killed Sophia. And Elena and Domenico, in the strange, exhausted aftermath of justice finally served, began, carefully, to build something neither of them had expected to survive long enough to have. "I have to tell you something," Elena said, 3 weeks after Vittoria's confession, sitting across from Domenico in the same study where everything had unraveled and been rebuilt. "My handler's been asking when I'm closing out this assignment. The case is solved. Sophia's murder is confirmed, documented, the perpetrator dealt with. There's no more mission left for Elena Moretti to complete." Domenico's expression didn't change, but something tightened behind his pale eyes. "And Elena Rossi? What does she want?" "I don't know yet," Elena admitted honestly. "I've spent 8 months being someone else. I'm not entirely sure who I am underneath all of it anymore." "I know who you are," Domenico said quietly, rising from his chair to cross the room, stopping in front of her with the same patient, deliberate intensity he'd worn the very first day they'd met. "You're the woman who walked into a house full of dangerous men and refused to be afraid of any of them. You're the woman who found her sister's killer and still had enough mercy left in her heart to insist on proof instead of blood, on justice instead of pure vengeance. You're the woman I've fallen in love with, Elena, whatever name you were wearing when it happened." Elena's breath caught. "Domenico." "I'm not asking you to stay for the mission," he said, his voice low and unguarded. "I'm asking you to stay for me, for this, whatever this is, that's grown between us in the wreckage of everything we've both lost. I know it's complicated. I know what I am, what this life demands, what it would mean for you to build a future inside a world you were trained to investigate rather than belong to. I'm not asking lightly." "I know what you're asking," Elena said softly, reaching up to cover his hand where it had come to rest against her cheek. "And I think I've known the answer for weeks, if I'm honest with myself." Before she could say it, whatever it was, the answer forming on her tongue, terrifying and certain in equal measure, a sharp, sudden wave of dizziness swept through her, strong enough that she gripped the arm of the chair to steady herself, black spots crowding the edges of her vision. "Elena?" Domenico's voice sharpened instantly, alarm replacing tenderness. "Elena, what's wrong?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears, the room tilting gently around her. "Just dizzy. It's probably just—" She didn't finish the sentence. The room went dark before she could, And the last thing she registered, falling, was Domenico's arms catching her, his voice shouting for Carmela, for a doctor, for anyone, his hands shaking against her face as consciousness slipped away entirely. She woke in a hospital bed at Grazioso hours later, IV lines taped to her arm. Domenico slumped in the chair beside her bed, with a face grey with terror, his hand wrapped around hers like he'd never once let go. "What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "You collapsed." His voice was raw, exhausted, frightened, in a way she'd never heard from him before, not even during Vittoria's confession. "I had them run every test available. Elena." His grip on her hand tightened. "Your blood work came back an hour ago." Something cold and terrible settled into Elena's stomach, a doctor's instinct recognizing dread before her mind fully processed why. "Tell me," she said. Domenico's face, when he finally met her eyes, was a portrait of devastation. "It's the same compound," he said, his voice breaking entirely. "The same poison Vittoria used on me, on Sophia. Someone's been administering it to you for weeks, Elena. Long before we ever found the ledger, long before Vittoria ever knew you were investigating her at all." The room seemed to tilt again, though this time it had nothing to do with the poison in her blood. "That's not possible," Elena whispered. "Vittoria's gone. Renata's in protective custody. There's no one left who—" "There's someone we missed," Domenico said, his voice a low, terrified certainty settling over both of them like a shroud. "Someone still in this house. Someone who's been poisoning you since before we ever caught my aunt at all." History, Elena understood, with a horror that ran bone deep, was not finished repeating itself. It had only just begun again. The hospital room felt suddenly unbearably small. "Run every test," Elena said, her physician's training overriding her fear, forcing calm into a voice that wanted to shake apart entirely. "I need to know exposure timeline, dosage levels, everything. If this predates Vittoria's confession, we need to understand who else had access." Domenico was already moving, barking orders into his phone with the cold, rapid efficiency of a man used to managing crises that would break lesser people entirely. Within the hour, Grazioso's toxicology lab, under strict private instruction to report findings to no one but Domenico and Elena directly, confirmed what Elena had already begun to suspect with dawning, sick horror. The exposure had begun nearly 6 weeks earlier, before the wellness panel Carmela had arranged, before Vittoria had ever openly moved against her. 6 weeks, Elena said slowly, staring at the report, her mind racing back through every interaction, every meal, every cup of coffee she'd consumed inside this house since the very beginning. "That's Domenico. That's almost exactly when I started coming here regularly. When I first began treating you." "You think someone's been poisoning you since your very first visit?" Domenico's face had gone ash pale. "Before you'd even found anything. Before you'd even confirmed Vittoria's involvement. It doesn't make sense unless—" Elena stopped, a horrifying possibility crystallizing with sudden, sickening clarity. "Unless whoever's doing this wasn't targeting the investigation. They were targeting me, specifically, from the moment I walked through your door. Which means it's not about Sophia's murder at all. It's about something else entirely." They spent the following 2 days in careful, urgent investigation, Domenico's men combing through household staff records, kitchen access logs, anyone who'd had proximity to Elena's food, her coffee, the medical supplies she used during her own visits to the estate. The answer, when it finally surfaced, came from the last person either of them expected: Carmela. The housekeeper who had warned Elena on her very first day about the doctor who'd come before her. He liked the last one even less at the end. Who had personally arranged the wellness panel. Who had served every meal, poured every cup of tea, moved through the household with the quiet, trusted invisibility of someone who had worked for the Falcone family for over 20 years and had never once been suspected of anything. Carmela's been with this family since before I was born, Domenico said, staring at the surveillance footage Elena's people had pulled, grainy but unmistakable, showing Carmela's hands adding something from a small vial to Elena's coffee cup 3 separate mornings over the past 6 weeks. She raised me, Elena. She was more of a mother to me than my own ever was. Why would she do this? Elena's voice shook. Exhaustion and betrayal and lingering poison all warring in her blood at once. What could she possibly gain? They found the answer in Carmela's small apartment above the estate's garage, a modest, carefully kept space that revealed, upon search, a shrine of sorts. Photographs of a young man Elena didn't recognize, clippings from newspapers dating back 7 years, financial records showing regular payments from an account Elena's federal contacts traced, after some effort, back to a rival crime family entirely separate from the Falcones. One Domenico's organization had crushed in a brutal territorial war 8 years earlier. That's her son, Domenico said quietly, staring at the photographs with dawning, horrified understanding. Carmela's son. He worked for the Moretti family. No relation to your alias, a rival organization we absorbed after a war that killed most of their leadership. He died in that conflict. I didn't even know Carmela had a son. She never spoke of family. I never thought to ask. The financial records told the rest of the story. The rival family's remaining leadership, scattered but not eliminated, had spent years quietly cultivating Carmela's grief and resentment into something usable. A source inside the Falcone household, patient and invisible, waiting for the right moment to strike at the man who had, unknowingly, destroyed her son's entire world. Vittoria's poisoning plot, and Carmela's, it turned out, had run in horrifying parallel for years. 2 separate conspiracies operating inside the same household, neither aware of the other, both converging on the same family with different motives and identical cruelty. Sophia had uncovered Vittoria's plot and died for it. Carmela, watching Sophia's investigation from the shadows, watching her die and the case close as a suicide, had simply continued her own separate, patient work undisturbed. And when Elena arrived, asking questions that echoed Sophia's a little too closely, Carmela had made the same calculation Vittoria eventually would, independently, without either woman ever realizing they shared a target. History wasn't simply repeating itself, Elena understood with sick, spiraling horror. It had never actually stopped. There had been 2 killers hiding in this house the entire time, and Elena had walked into the crosshairs of both of them without ever knowing the second blade was there at all. Carmela didn't run when they came for her. She sat in the small, tidy kitchen where she'd served 3 generations of Falcone family meals, her hands folded in her lap, and looked up at Domenico with an expression that held no fear at all, only a bone-deep, exhausted grief that had clearly been waiting years for this exact moment to arrive. "You look just like your father when you're angry," she said quietly, before Domenico could speak. "He had that same look the day he ordered the raid that killed my Antonio. I stood in this same kitchen and served him dinner that night. I never told him what he'd taken from me. I decided instead that I would simply wait." "7 years," Domenico said, his voice a low, devastated rasp. "7 years, Carmela. You raised me. You held me the night my mother died. You were the only steady thing in this entire house, and this whole time, I was grieving my son exactly as much as you grieved your mother," Carmela said, and for the first time her composure cracked, tears sliding silently down a face lined with decades of quiet, careful servitude. "You never asked about my family, Domenico. Not once, in 30 years. I don't say that as an accusation, simply a fact. This family consumes everyone who serves it and rarely thinks to ask what they've lost in the process." "I would have listened," Domenico said, his voice breaking. "If you'd told me. I would have. Would you?" Carmela's eyes, when they lifted to his, held a terrible, patient certainty. "Your father killed my son in a war over territory neither of them needed. You inherited that war, that blood, that entire rotten empire, and you expected me to simply keep serving dinner and asking nothing in return. I loved you, Domenico. That was never a lie, but I loved my son more, and I owed him a debt this family would never have paid willingly." Elena stood beside Domenico, her own blood still carrying the poison this woman had administered, weeks of quiet, patient betrayal disguised as morning coffee and warm concern, and found, despite everything, that she couldn't summon pure hatred for the broken, grieving woman in front of her, only a deep, aching sorrow for how much cruelty this family's world had manufactured, generation after generation, grief begetting grief, until no one left standing remembered how to stop the cycle. "Why me?" Elena asked quietly. "I had nothing to do with your son's death, nothing to do with any of this before I walked through that door." "You reminded them of Sophia," Carmela said simply. "The men who pay me, they'd been watching this family for years, waiting for weakness. When Sophia started asking questions, they saw an opportunity, encouraged Vittoria's plot from a careful distance, fed her resources when she needed them, though she never knew the source. When Sophia died and the investigation vanished into a closed suicide case, they assumed the threat was neutralized." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Then you arrived, Dottoressa, with your careful questions and your sister's exact eyes, and they grew afraid you'd finish what she started. They didn't order me to kill you outright, not at first. They asked me to weaken you, slow you down, buy time to assess how much you actually knew." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I told myself it wasn't the same as what happened to Sophia. I told myself I was simply protecting my own interests, not committing murder. I understand now that I was lying to myself the entire time." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, grief and fury and exhausted sorrow tangled together in a kitchen that had witnessed 30 years of this family's meals and was now witnessing the unraveling of one final, terrible secret. "The antidote," Elena said finally, her physician's mind cutting through the emotional wreckage to the one thing that actually mattered now. "Carmela, I need to know. Is there a way to reverse this?" "Vittoria's compound, the one used on Domenico for 3 years. Did you develop something to counter it, in case you needed to walk it back?"
Something shifted in Carmela's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that Elena would even ask, that survival still felt like a live possibility worth pursuing. "There's a compound," she said slowly. "The men who supplied me the poison also supplied a counteragent, in case dosing ever needed correction. It's in my medical cabinet upstairs. I can show you. I don't—" Her voice cracked. "I don't want you to die, Dottoressa. I told myself many lies these past weeks, but I never once told myself I wanted you dead. Only slowed. Only frightened enough to leave." Domenico's hand found Elena's, gripping tight enough to bruise. Hope and terror warring openly across his face, for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun.
"Show us," he said, his voice raw. "Now, please, Carmela, whatever else is true between us, show us now." The counteragent sat in a small, unmarked vial inside Carmela's private medical cabinet, and Elena's hands shook, a doctor's fear now, sharper and more personal than anything she'd felt during 6 months of undercover training, as she examined its composition against everything she knew of the poison circulating through her own blood. "It should work," she said slowly, cross-referencing the compound against her memory of Vittoria's ledger, against everything Sophia's notes had documented 3 years earlier, against every hour of pharmacology she'd crammed into her skull during training that had never once prepared her for administering an antidote to save her own life. In theory. But 6 weeks of exposure means significant accumulation. This needs to be precise: dosage, timing, monitoring for adverse reaction. I can't administer this to myself and simply hope for the best. "Then you won't administer it alone," Domenico said immediately. Already moving, already calling for Grazioso's actual medical staff, the real doctors, the ones who had no idea the woman they knew as Dr. Moretti wasn't licensed at all, brought in now under Domenico's absolute authority and sworn to silence about whatever they witnessed. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of clinical urgency. IV lines, careful titration, blood draws every 30 minutes to monitor the compound's effect against the poison already circulating through Elena's system. Domenico never once leaving her side, despite Elena's repeated, weakening insistence that he should be resting, should be managing the fallout of Carmela's confession, should be doing anything other than gripping her hand like a lifeline while she fought her own body's slow betrayal. "You should be furious with her," Elena murmured at one point, exhaustion and the lingering poison making her voice thin and distant. "Carmela, after everything—" "I am furious with her," Domenico said quietly. "I'm furious with my father for a war that created this grief in the first place. I'm furious with my aunt for turning love into a weapon. I'm furious with an entire world that consumes people like Carmela's son and Sophia and nearly you and calls it simply the cost of business." His hand tightened around hers. "But I don't have room left for that fury right now, Elena. Right now, I only have room to be terrified of losing you." "I'm not going anywhere," Elena said, though even as she said it, another wave of dizziness swept through her, and the machines monitoring her vitals let out a soft, urgent chime that made every doctor in the room move at once. Her heart rate's dropping, one of the physicians said, urgency cutting through clinical calm. We need to adjust the dosage, now. The next several minutes blurred into a chaos of clinical urgency Elena experienced from a strange, floating distance. Voices calling numbers, hands adjusting IV lines, Domenico's voice cutting through it all, low and commanding, refusing to leave the room despite being ordered out twice by physicians who had no idea who they were actually speaking to. Elena. His voice found her through the haze, steady and desperate all at once, his hand cupping her face, forcing her half-lidded eyes to focus on him. Stay with me. Do you hear me? Stay with me. I refuse to bury you the way I buried her. I refuse. I'm trying, Elena whispered, and meant it with everything left in her, fighting against a darkness that felt eerily, terribly familiar. The same darkness, she understood distantly, that had likely claimed her sister in her final moments, except Sophia had faced it entirely alone, with no one's hand gripping hers, no one fighting beside her to hold the darkness back. I'm not going to die the way you did, Elena thought, fighting to hold consciousness, fighting for every laboured breath. I have someone here who won't let me. You didn't have that, Sophia. I'm so sorry you didn't have that. The dosage adjustment worked. Slowly, agonizingly, over the following 2 hours, Elena's vitals stabilized, the poison's grip on her blood beginning, finally, to loosen beneath the counteragent's careful, monitored administration. By the time dawn broke over the Falcone estate, painting the windows of the medical suite gold, Elena was breathing easier, colour returning to her face, the machine's urgent chiming finally, blessedly, silent. Domenico hadn't left her side once, hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His exhausted, unshaven face, the first thing Elena saw when she finally opened her eyes fully and found the strength to squeeze his hand. Hey, she whispered. The sound that came out of him wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something raw and relieved and utterly overwhelmed all at once. Hey, he echoed, pressing his forehead to hers, his whole body shaking with the release of hours of terror finally allowed to break. God, Elena, don't ever do that to me again. I'll do my best, she managed, a weak, exhausted smile tugging at her mouth. Not to get poisoned twice by the same family. Not funny, Domenico said, though something wet gleamed in his pale eyes, relief and love tangled together in an expression she'd never seen him wear before, entirely unguarded, entirely hers. Not even a little bit funny, dottoressa. A little bit, Elena whispered, and let herself, finally, rest. Recovery took weeks, slow, careful, monitored with a precision Elena had once reserved for her patients, and now, humbling and strange, had turned entirely on herself. Carmela's fate became the subject of long, difficult negotiation, one Elena found herself surprisingly invested in shaping. Domenico's instinct, the cold, absolute justice he'd delivered to Vittoria, would have ended differently for the woman who'd raised him, had Elena not intervened. She's still a killer, Domenico said, the argument circling for the third night in a row, both of them exhausted, both of them raw with grief that had nowhere fully safe to land. She poisoned you, Elena, slowly, deliberately, for weeks. She's also a mother who lost her son to a war neither of us started, manipulated by people far more dangerous than she ever was, who finally chose at the end to save my life instead of finish taking it. Elena met his eyes steadily. I'm not asking you to forgive her, Domenico. I'm asking you to remember that not every wound in this family healed the same way or deserved the same ending. Vittoria killed out of ambition and cruelty. Carmela killed out of grief that this family's own violence created in the first place. Those aren't the same crime, even if the outcome came close to being identical. In the end, Carmela was quietly relocated, not punished with the finality Vittoria had received, but removed from the Falcone household entirely, provided with resources to live out her remaining years far from the family she'd served and ultimately betrayed. Her testimony against the rival organization that had manipulated her grief, providing valuable intelligence that let Domenico dismantle the last remaining threat to his rebuilt, cleaner empire. It wasn't perfect justice. Elena understood that better than anyone, understood that nothing about this world offered clean resolutions, that grief simply passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, until someone, somewhere, finally chose to set it down instead of passing it forward. She hoped, watching Carmela leave the estate for the last time, quiet and diminished, and finally free of the secret she'd carried, that this was at least a step towards setting something down instead of picking up more. 6 weeks after the poison finally cleared her system entirely, Elena stood on the terrace of Domenico's Manhattan penthouse, a space she'd visited a dozen times now, each visit feeling a little more like coming home than the last, watching the city glitter below in the deepening blue of early evening. Her federal handler had called that afternoon, the final debrief on Sophia's case complete, the file formally closed, Vittoria's crimes documented and filed in whatever quiet, off-the-books channel handled cases too politically complicated for open prosecution. Elena Rossi's cover as Elena Moretti had been formally retired. She was, for the first time in 8 months, simply herself again. No assignment, no mission, no false name to answer to. You're quiet, Domenico said, joining her on the terrace, 2 glasses of wine in hand, offering her one with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything. I closed the case today, Elena said, officially. Sophia's file is finished. The bureau's satisfied. I could walk away from all of this completely if I wanted. Go back to my old life, my old name. Pretend the last 8 months were simply an assignment I completed and moved past. Domenico's expression didn't change, but something careful entered his voice. Is that what you want? Elena turned to face him fully, the city lights glittering gold behind his dark silhouette, and felt, for the first time since she'd walked into Grazioso wearing a dead woman's name, something like peace settle into her chest. No, she said simply. I came here to find my sister's killer. I found her. I found something else, too, along the way. Something I never expected. Something that terrified me more than any part of the mission ever did. She stepped closer, reaching up to rest her palm against his jaw, feeling the tension there ease beneath her touch, the way it always did, the way she'd come to understand was entirely, uniquely hers to soothe. I don't want to go back to my old life, Domenico. I want to build a new one. Here, with you, if that's something you still want, after everything this has cost us both. Elena. His voice was rough, his hand coming up to cover hers against his face. I have wanted exactly that since the night you told me the truth in my study, and I realized I'd fallen in love with a liar I couldn't imagine my life without. There has never been a single moment since then that I haven't wanted this." He kissed her then, slow and certain, none of the desperate urgency of their first kiss weeks earlier, but something steadier beneath it, the particular tenderness of two people who had survived enough grief and danger together to trust, finally, that what remained between them was solid enough to build a real life upon. "Sophia would be glad," Elena whispered against his mouth, "that you found someone who wasn't afraid of you, either." "Sophia would be furious," Domenico murmured back, a real smile finally breaking across his face, "that her little sister lied her way into my house and stole my heart using an alias built from a dead woman's medical license." Elena laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't let herself feel in 8 long, grief-soaked months, and let him pull her closer into the warm circle of his arms, the city spread glittering and endless below them, a future finally, cautiously, beginning to take shape. 1 year later, the Falcone estate looked different in ways that had little to do with architecture. Vittoria's portrait, which had hung in the main hallway for 3 decades, had long since been removed, replaced by a photograph Elena had taken herself. Domenico laughing, genuinely and unguardedly, at something Marco had said during a family dinner that no longer felt like a battlefield disguised as a meal. Marco, freed from his mother's manipulation and his own resentment, had found an unexpected talent for legitimate business, quietly steering a significant portion of the family's holdings toward ventures that no longer required violence to protect. Isabella's daughter ran laughing through hallways that had once felt cold and watchful, filling them instead with the particular chaos of a childhood no longer shadowed by inherited cruelty. Elena had left federal service entirely, a decision that had taken months of careful conversation, of weighing everything she'd built her identity around against everything she'd found unexpectedly, terrifyingly real in a Mafia don's study on a grey January afternoon. She'd taken her actual medical license, earned properly this time through an accelerated program her handler had quietly arranged as a strange final favour for a job well done, and opened a small private practice in the city, one that specialised, with grim, purposeful irony, in patients whose medical histories required the kind of careful, discreet attention Grazioso had once weaponised. She treated people the underworld's usual doctors overlooked, undocumented workers and witness protection families, and anyone else the system preferred to pretend didn't exist, and found in that work something that felt like genuine restitution for the lie she'd once worn like armour. Domenico had changed too in the year since Vittoria's fall, not softened exactly, because the world he moved through demanded a certain ruthlessness that Elena had long since stopped expecting him to abandon entirely, but recalibrated. He trusted more carefully now, watched more closely, but no longer with the isolated, armoured suspicion that had defined him the day Elena first walked into his study. He'd rebuilt the family's inner circle from people Isabella and Marco vouched for personally, people who had proven, through the crucible of Vittoria's exposure, that their loyalty ran deeper than ambition. The wedding, when it finally came, was small, deliberately so, Domenico's insistence, a private ceremony at the estate rather than the sprawling, politically fraught spectacle a Falcone wedding traditionally demanded. Elena wore ivory instead of white, a small rebellion against tradition that made Domenico laugh when he saw her, the same unguarded laugh she'd fallen in love with somewhere in the chaos of the past year. "You look like you're about to run," he murmured, as they stood together on the terrace where he'd asked her to marry him 6 months earlier, the same terrace where she'd told him she wanted to build a life with him instead of walking away. "I've gotten very good at running," Elena said, smiling up at him. "Over the past 2 years, this is the first time I've actually wanted to stay." "Good," he said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered hiding from her, "because I don't intend to ever let you leave." The ceremony was brief, intimate, witnessed by the small circle of people who had survived the past year's reckoning together. Marco and Isabella, their daughter scattering flower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy, a handful of trusted capos who had proven their loyalty beyond question, and, standing quietly at the back, a framed photograph Elena had insisted on including. Sophia, laughing, captured in a moment of unguarded joy from years before her death, present in the only way she still could be. "To Sophia," Domenico said, during the small reception that followed, raising his glass to the photograph with a solemnity that silenced the gathered crowd entirely, "who loved this family enough to die protecting it from itself, and who gave me, in the end, the sister she never got the chance to fully introduce me to. I owe her a debt I can never fully repay. I intend to spend the rest of my life trying anyway." Elena's eyes filled with tears, grief and joy tangled together the way they'd been tangled for 2 years now, ever since the day she'd buried her sister and decided to become someone else entirely to find the truth. She thought of Sophia's last journal entry, the frightened, urgent words about loving a dangerous man and fearing it would cost her everything. It had cost Sophia everything. But it had given Elena, in the end, more than she'd ever imagined finding in the wreckage of her sister's murder. A love as fierce and certain as anything Sophia had described. A family rebuilt from its own worst rot into something stronger. And a life she'd never once expected to want, standing on a terrace in ivory instead of federal issue black. Married to a man who had once terrified her and now felt, simply, like home. "I love you," Domenico murmured, drawing her close as the small gathering began to dance beneath string lights strung across the terrace, the city glittering endless and gold below them. "I loved you from the moment you refused to be afraid of me, Dottoressa. I think some part of me knew, even then, that you were going to save my life in far more ways than one." "I love you too," Elena whispered back, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, healthy rhythm of a heart that had finally, fully healed. "Even though you're impossible and dangerous and entirely too used to getting your own way." "I got you," Domenico said, a smile in his voice pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'd say that qualifies as the one time getting my own way. Turned out to be the best decision I ever made." Above them, the New York sky stretched dark and endless, the same sky that had watched a grieving sister walk into a hospital wearing a dead woman's name. The same sky that had watched 2 separate conspiracies nearly claim her life the way they'd claimed her sister's before her. But beneath that sky, on a terrace transformed from crime scene to celebration, 2 people who had survived betrayal, poison, and grief in equal measure held each other close, finally, fully safe. Proof that even in a world built on lies and violence, something real and lasting could still be found, if you were brave enough, and patient enough, and loved fiercely enough to fight for it. The imposter doctor had come to New York searching for the truth about her sister's death. She left with a family, a love, and a life entirely her own. No longer an imposter, no longer hiding, finally, completely herself.